While researching the list of serial killers by number of victims, I came across Russia's most ruthless serial killer. This criminal had committed exactly 86 murders, and the police could not catch him for 20 years. At least, that's how the introduction will go. For the first time, I discovered such detailed information about the places where these horrific crimes were committed, and what I learned was chilling. Just a few decades ago, the bodies of the killer's victims were found in these areas, but now the land is covered in snow. If you're ready, let's begin the video. The 1990s. In the dark streets of Russia, it was the golden age of crime. This trend had spread even to the most remote regions, such as Siberia. One of those places was the city of Angarsk, located in the Irkutsk region of eastern Siberia. Angarsk is an industrial-type city with a population of only 220,000. In terms of infrastructure, the city was not very developed, and even today this situation remains almost the same. That is why a large part of the young population goes to the nearby larger city of Irkutsk for education or entertainment. Between Irkutsk and Angarsk stretches a forest road that runs for kilometers. Although this road looks quite beautiful during the day in terms of scenery, at night it often becomes a dangerous place for travelers or locals. Unfortunately, among the dense trees of these Siberian forests, horrific crimes were committed many times, and the bodies of some missing people were never found. Even more terrifying was the fact that most of these crimes were committed by a single man. His name was Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov. But the most shocking part was that Popkov was a police officer.
Все говорили, что он такой идеальный человек, что он так любил свою безумную жену, что он любил безумно дочь, что он такой хороший товарищ и друг. Вот он просто был идеальный.
В Ангарске все знали его как хорошего, доброго семьянина.
Я себе в мечтах ни в чем не отказываю.
Mikhail Popkov was born on March 7, 1964, in the city of Norilsk. A few years after his birth, his family moved to Angarsk. After settling in Angarsk and bringing Mikhail with them, they told him that he had a little sister. This unexpected news affected young Mikhail's psychology in some way. At that time, he was not mentally ready for his parents' attention to be directed toward another child. This caused Mikhail to harbor a childish resentment toward his family. For this reason, from a young age, he tried his best to earn the love of his parents. He behaved well and made an effort to succeed in school. During his teenage years, he developed a great interest in skiing and generally lived a life intertwined with sports. With an athletic build, Mikhail always maintained his physical form. After finishing middle school, he enrolled in a vocational school where he studied mechanics. In his spare time, he often helped his father. Together with his father, he worked digging graves. After graduating from vocational school, Mikhail was drafted into the Soviet Army and served for 2 years in Mongolia. After completing his military service and returning to civilian life, Mikhail met a woman named Yelena. Following the common family culture in Russian society, the couple married early in their relationship. From this marriage, they had a daughter named Yekaterina. Their family lived a fairly ordinary life. Work, household chores, childcare, outdoor, recreation and weekend gatherings with friends were all part of this routine. In his younger years, Mikhail did not drink alcohol. Arguments within the family were rare. According to Yelena, Mikhail never physically abused her. However, as he grew older, he began to drink occasionally, though this habit was quite infrequent. One notable characteristic of Mikhail's personality was his obsessive sense of discipline. He had a great interest in cars and always kept his vehicle in immaculate condition. This trait would later play an important role in his criminal past, but we will return to that detail later. To earn money, Mikhail worked in the car transport business, driving vehicles from Vladivostok. Vladivostok, located on the coast of the Sea of Japan in Russia's Far East, is a large port city and an important hub for trade with Japan. For decades, Japan had been exporting used cars to Russia through Vladivostok, and many Russians made a living by driving these vehicles back to their own cities. For Mikhail, this job became more of a hobby starting from 1990. His main source of income, however, was working for the Angarsk City Police Department, where he served both as a taxi driver and an operations officer. Mikhail's colleagues in the police force generally spoke of him in positive terms, since he always carried out the tasks assigned to him with a strong sense of responsibility. At that time, the workload of the local police force was very heavy. The high crime rate demanded a constant work pace. The atmosphere in society was so tense that not only women but even men did not feel safe walking the streets at night. In some eastern cities, public transportation and taxi services were still underdeveloped. As a result, people often had to rely on hitchhiking to get from one place to another. However, especially at night, this practice could be dangerous even for men. Robberies and murders were quite common. During that period, a widespread belief existed in society. It was considered safe for hitchhikers to accept rides only from people they knew personally or from police officers. Despite such caution among the locals, crime rates in the 1990s kept increasing month by month. Starting from 1994, the mysterious disappearances of women in the city of Angarsk began to cause a great stir among the public. The missing women were usually between the ages of 15 and 40, and most disappeared in the evenings while trying to get from one place to another. Many of them were forced to travel along the road that stretched between Angarsk and Irkutsk. After months of searching, their bodies were often found in forests, secluded areas, or near local cemeteries. At that time, Angarsk police did not consider the women's murders to be connected for several reasons. First, the ages of the victims and the methods of killing differed from one another. Second, these crimes were investigated by detectives from different police districts. The detectives did not compare the cases with one another or analyze them within a logical framework.
Снежана Владимировна?
Да.
Отдел милиции №1, дежурная часть беспокоит. По вашему заявлению. Оставляли?
А что случилось?
В отделение подъезжайте.
Их нашли?
В отделении расскажут.
By the late 1990s, however, the Angarsk police archives had accumulated 30 unsolved murder cases. At this point, detectives began to notice similarities between the crimes. The murdered women shared strikingly similar physical appearances. The victims were generally between 155 and 170 centimeters tall and had slightly plump body types. Every victim had been raped and was under the influence of alcohol at the time of the crime. However, in one case, no traces of alcohol or signs of physical assault were found on the body. The killer usually attacked his victims with sharp objects such as knives, axes, or screwdrivers. Some women were strangled with belts or scarves. Two of the victims, however, were killed in an especially brutal manner. One had her heart removed while the other was burned to death.
Такая черта была вот у этого серийного преступника, убийцы, да, что вот он оголял жертвы. То есть либо полностью раздевал, либо задирал верхнюю часть одежды выше грудей, а юбки, либо колготки, там, брюки, джинсы спускал ниже колен. В таком виде оставлял потерпевших. В году таких преступлений уже накопилось достаточно. И в 1998 году создали первую следственно-оперативную группу.
In 1998, while these murders were still under investigation, the Angarsk police offered Mikhail Popkov a promotion, intending to raise him to the rank of sergeant within the force. However, instead of accepting the position, Mikhail requested permission to resign. His colleagues could not understand why he had made such a sudden decision, since they believed him to be a responsible police officer and a good family man. But they had no idea of Popkov's true nature. Behind the mask of a dutiful policeman and loving father, a monster was hiding. It was around that very year that rumors about a serial killer in Angarsk began to spread rapidly. Photos of missing victims were frequently published in local newspapers. For a time, continuing to work as a police officer was an advantage for Mikhail Popkov, as it allowed him to closely follow the investigations into his own crimes and gave him time to eliminate any evidence he might have left behind. Yet the greatest advantage of being a police officer was the reputation that enabled him to easily gain women's trust. As I mentioned earlier, local people hitchhiking often preferred to get into cars belonging to acquaintances or police officers. Mikhail took advantage of this, frequently picking up women from the roadside. When they saw a neatly dressed policeman with an impeccably clean car, the women formed a positive impression of Mikhail and accepted his offer of help. During these rides, Mikhail would skillfully flirt with the women, then suggest spending some time together while drinking alcohol. He rarely drank more than 2 bottles of beer himself, while his victims usually consumed wine or stronger liquor. After parking his car in a wooded area, he would drink with them and then subject them to sexual assault. Immediately after these assaults, Mikhail would usually kill his victims by striking them on the head with sharp tools. An interesting detail is that he only carried out these acts on women who accepted his offer to drink alcohol. He considered these women immoral and described his murders as an act of purifying society from immorality. Women who refused his offers were often taken safely back to their homes, and sometimes he even helped carry their bags. But for this killer, there was no consistent rule. According to investigation records, there were 2 women who survived Mikhail's sexual assaults but remained silent for years. One day, 18-year-old Yevgenia Pirasatova, who lived in Angarsk, went out for a walk with her boyfriend late at night. During this time, an argument broke out between them, and in anger, her boyfriend left Yevgenia alone on the roadside. Since it was very late, she had no way of returning home by public transport. After a while, a Lada Niva driven by Mikhail Popkov pulled up beside her. Mikhail showed his police ID, and Yevgenia trusted him enough to get into the car. But the moment she sat down, Mikhail struck her head with a strong blow and the young woman lost consciousness. When she regained consciousness, she was already in a forest, in an unknown place. She remembered nothing about what Mikhail might have done to her in the car. However, he dragged her out of the vehicle and began hitting her head with a sharp object. Mikhail left the young woman in the forest, convinced she was dead, and fled the scene. But Yevgenia managed to survive. The next morning, a villager collecting mushrooms found her and immediately called an ambulance and the police. Yevgenia was severely injured due to the blows to her head and suffered memory loss. She underwent years of treatment. Her memory partially returned over time, but she could never remember who had carried out this horrific attack. Another victim who survived Mikhail Popkov's assault was a university student hitchhiking to the nearby city of Irkutsk. Shortly after getting into Popkov's car, the young woman began to hear disturbing, inappropriate comments from him. When she asked to get out of the car, Mikhail instead drove her to a forest and sexually assaulted her. After the assault, however, he did not kill her. Instead, he told her, "I like you," and drove her back home. This student never dared to tell even her family about what happened, because her father was a very strict man. But she remembered Mikhail Popkov's appearance, his car, and the fact that he was a police officer. Years later, her testimony became an important turning point in the investigation. This building you see here was where the Popkov family's apartment was located. At first, you might wonder why the apartment of a serial killer should attract attention. But it was in this very home, in this very building, that the events occurred which triggered the beginning of Mikhail Popkov's criminal career. One day, after returning from work, Mikhail parked his car in this courtyard and saw his daughter Yekaterina outside, dressed inappropriately for the weather. He asked her why she was outside at that hour and why she was dressed so lightly. Yekaterina explained that there was a strange man visiting in their home and that her mother had told her to play outside for an hour. After this incident, Mikhail learned that his wife had been unfaithful to him. Moreover, he realized that these affairs had happened more than once. However, in his view, instead of confronting his wife about it, he chose to maintain an ordinary family life for the sake of their daughter. Yet inside, he was building up a deep reservoir of anger. According to some acquaintances, every morning when Mikhail woke up next to his wife, he would check to see if he had accidentally killed her in his sleep because of the rage boiling inside him. After Popkov was arrested, he admitted in interviews with journalists that his wife's infidelity was one of the reasons for his crimes. However, he also said it was not the main reason. Now you may be wondering how Mikhail Popkov was eventually caught. For many years this was impossible. The Angarsk police simply did not have the financial resources to conduct a large-scale investigation. Moreover, reports of serial murder cases had to be sent to Moscow in full, which carried the risk of damaging the reputation of Angarsk city. Another factor that complicated the investigation was Mikhail Popkov's experience as a police officer, which allowed him to successfully conceal evidence at crime scenes. But there were always two details he overlooked. First, he could never fully erase traces of his DNA from the victims' bodies. Still, this did not frighten him much, since at the time DNA analysis in Russia's remote regions was rarely performed and extremely expensive. Second, the tire tracks of his car always posed a risk of exposure. After resigning from the police force and starting to collect a pension, Mikhail never worked in any official position again. To earn extra income, he unofficially worked as a security guard for a private company and continued working as a taxi driver using his personal car. From time to time, he also kept transporting second-hand cars from Vladivostok to Angarsk. For him, however, these jobs were not only a source of income, but also an opportunity to continue committing horrific crimes. The investigation into this series of murders began in 1998 and continued until 2015. Detectives compiled 30 women's murder cases, analyzed the common elements, and studied the killer's behavioral patterns. From this, they created a possible criminal profile and identified 38,000 men living in Angarsk and Irkutsk as potential suspects. Detectives spent years questioning and investigating them, but none of them matched the profile of the serial killer. After the year 2000, detectives obtained a new clue. Most of the victims had been found near the forest areas surrounding the road between Irkutsk and Angarsk. At that time, there was a police checkpoint at the exit of Angarsk, which recorded every vehicle leaving the city at night. Detectives examined the checkpoint records for the periods when the murders were committed. They discovered that none of the tire tracks at the crime scenes matched the cars recorded at the checkpoint. This raised the question of why the killer's car was not listed in the checkpoint logs. Detectives concluded there could only be one explanation. The killer was a police officer, since only police vehicles were not recorded at the checkpoint. Another important breakthrough came from Yevgenia Protasova, one of the women who had survived an attack by Mikhail Popkov. After a long recovery, her memory slowly began to return. She recalled that her attacker had identified himself as a police officer. With this crucial detail, her family went to the police. Based on this information, detectives became convinced they needed to focus their investigation on local police officers. This reduced the pool of suspects to 598 individuals. Detectives had already identified the killer's DNA from the victims' bodies. However, to match it to suspects, they needed molecular genetic testing. At the time, though, the cost of a DNA test in Russia was around $10,000, making the investigation extremely difficult. Even with support from the Eastern Siberia Police Headquarters, their budget only allowed a few DNA tests per year. For years, despite questioning suspects, the investigation went nowhere. In 2009, however, the regional police department learned of a new DNA analysis technology and gained access to it. This allowed them to conduct up to 400 DNA tests per year at a fraction of the previous cost. This breakthrough greatly accelerated the investigation. Within a year, nearly all active duty police officers' DNA samples were checked. None matched the killer's DNA. As a result, detectives decided to expand their scope to include not only active officers, but also former ones. Thanks to this decision, Mikhail Popkov became a suspect. When detectives asked Popkov to provide a DNA sample, he calmly agreed. He was convinced that investigators still lacked reliable evidence to compare his DNA with. What he did not realize was how much forensic technology had advanced during that time. After giving his sample, Mikhail consulted a lawyer friend and confided that he might become the prime suspect in the serial murder case. Shortly after, detectives received the DNA test results. Mikhail Popkov's DNA matched the serial killer's with 100% certainty. Armed with this evidence, an operations team was formed to arrest him. Police raided the Popkov family's apartment, but no one was home. Mikhail had already fled the city with his family. After several days of searching, he was captured in Vladivostok and formally charged with serial murder. When he was handed over to police, Popkov did not resist. At first, he confessed to only 22 murders and 2 attempted murders. The trial lasted from 2012 to 2015, during which Mikhail described his crimes in detail, pointed out the murder sites, and explained how he killed each victim. On January 14, 2015, the Irkutsk Regional Court sentenced Mikhail Popkov to life imprisonment. He was sent to serve his sentence in one of Russia's harshest prisons, the Black Dolphin Penal Colony in the Orenburg region. This prison holds some of the country's most ruthless criminals serving life sentences.
После его задержания, когда он уже оказался в СИЗО, тут же приехали корреспонденты с телевизионных каналов, с интернет-изданий. И все стали охотиться за ним, за его родственниками. Получается, осады целых зданий проводились с утра до вечера с видеокамерами. Он все это видел, понимал, что как бы это все негативно отразится на его семье. И вот он сказал: давайте я буду признаваться в совершении преступления, но вот вы как бы обеспечите безопасность моей семье.
During the 2 years he spent in prison, Mikhail confessed to 60 more murders. According to him, he had initially kept quiet about some crimes and struggled to remember others for months. He showed detectives the burial sites of victims who had been reported missing for years, confirming that they had all been killed by him. The places where Mikhail committed his murders were not limited to the forests of Angarsk. They also included parts of Irkutsk, Ussolye-Sibirskoye, and even areas along the road to Vladivostok. One of his victims was a close friend, who was also a police officer. In 1999, Mikhail visited this friend at his home. They spent the evening drinking and talking. Under the influence of alcohol, Mikhail confessed to several murders. But the next morning, fearing that his friend might report him to the police, he panicked and stabbed him to death. He then carefully destroyed the evidence. This crime remained unsolved until Mikhail later confessed to it. Many people in the Irkutsk region believe that their loved ones, who went missing years ago and are still listed as disappeared, were also victims of Mikhail Popkov. In recent years, 2 more trials have been held against him. In 2017, a trial concluded regarding the 60 additional murders he had confessed to. After this, Popkov was transferred to another high-security penal colony, the Torbasky Central Prison in the Mordovia region. In 2023, another trial was held in which Mikhail confessed to 2 more murders committed in 1999. As of today, he is serving 2 life sentences. According to Russian crime statistics, in terms of victim count, Popkov's crimes make up the country's deadliest serial murder case. The fact that such a monster was hiding behind the mask of a law enforcement officer is horrifying to even imagine. In numerous interviews with journalists, Popkov never once expressed genuine remorse for his atrocities. His cold-bloodedness and indifference to human life have inflicted immeasurable pain and grief on dozens of Russian families. For more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, leave a like, and share your comments. Thank you for watching.